What's going wrong with America? A white American, apparently motivated by political apartheid ideologies, recently massacred 9 black worshippers in a church in Charleston. It is also claimed that he intended to kill himself but had run out of bullets. Despite receiving heavy coverage in the Western media, it has not been portrayed as a terror attack. Why not? What's the difference between this incident and the actions of a suicide bomber? At the same time, US police officers have killed over 500 people this year alone. Disturbingly, over a quarter of those killed had mental health issues. Recently, 2 officers shot an unarmed man in the head after he asked for help, and then, bizarrely, began to handcuff his motionless body. Has this state-sponsored killing provoked the public to resort to violence too? Gun violence seems beyond control in the US. In the last few weeks alone, there have been countless shootings across the country. In New Jersey, 3 people were shot and wounded during a Father's Day party at a park. Only slightly earlier, there were 2 more mass shootings in Detroit and in West Philadelphia. Even before that, 4 people were shot during a basketball tournament outside a school in Connecticut. Every week, there are more reports and videos of brutality and bizarre behaviour by US police and gun violence by the public, causing many to wonder where America is heading, despite having a black and Democrat president. What is driving so many young Americans to violence? How can there be so much racism and police violence under a black Democrat president? And do the American police force have any credibility left at all? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. And we began with that white American, apparently motivated by apartheid ideologies, who massacred 9 black worshippers. The incident received a lot of coverage in the West. But why hasn't it been portrayed as a terror attack? That's the question we put to the American public.
I thought it was a terrorist attack. It was. But why hasn't it? Because, from my opinion, the media is influenced, and the people in power are influenced by the National Rifle Association and the Koch brothers and the Adelsons, the people that have a big investment and making a lot of money out of selling weapons and arms and guns and stuff like that.
Mostly, people don't take violent crimes serious anymore. Now you see people kill each other, it's not even terrorism anymore. But when it's foreign people coming into America starting, it's called terror. I don't understand either.
That's a good question. I think, like, when we think of terrorists, we think of like foreign entities, you know, but they're also domestic terrorists as well.
Racial topics are more of a hot topic right now than terrorism.
Honestly, I don't know. It's always unfortunate when innocents are brutally murdered, so I would definitely call it a terrorist attack. I don't know why it hasn't been in national media.
So those are the views of the public. We invited our experts to consider why this incident, bearing so many hallmarks of terrorism, has not been reported as a terror attack.
I think for us where we need to start is to look at etymologically the history of the word terrorism itself, and how it has become to describe, what used to describe violent criminal, whatever it might want to call it, by people who are non-white, yes, who are resident in the northern hemisphere, yes. If you take the United States, for example, there have been histories of white people bombing churches, including Waco in Texas and so on, in which white perpetrators have committed crimes against number of people. That has never been called terrorism, okay? Whereas this time, okay, it's never been called. If it's a black person, the pattern has tended to be immediately assumed that to be terrorism. That's one sense. The second thing, it's happening at a certain time in which, because of the West's response to 9/11, whether one likes it or not, the people who come from America's racial geography also is written into that meaning of the word terrorism. So descriptions of non-white or non-northern or non-Anglo-Saxon or non-Christian people whatever it is that they're doing becomes immediately assumed to be terrorism. I'm not saying sometimes it isn't, but I'm just saying the use of the term is different when you look at the way in which those racial geographies are made up.
So I think this is not an isolated incident. It's something that we've seen time and time again in the United States. Anytime that there's a shooting that involves a young white male, it's never billed as terrorism. We could look at any number of school shootings that have taken place over the past decade. We can look at this particular incident, or we could even look at the incidences that have occurred of police brutality and the murder of young African-American males. I mean, this is something that should be referred to as police terrorism rather than police brutality, because it actually fits the very same definition. But when it's a young white male, usually it gets billed as this person had some mental difficulties, and we always look for the angle of mental illness rather than looking at the ideology that may have been behind it. In this case, it was incredibly obvious that this was somebody motivated by white supremacy. And yet you had a situation where the far right, or even elements within the Democratic Party, were saying, hold on, we're not quite sure that he was motivated by those ideals, when the first image that surfaced had the flags of Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa. And it's also something that goes abroad. It's not just a case of within the United States. It's also a case of any time that the United States is fighting a war or a proxy war in other countries, their freedom fighters are never considered to be terrorists. But when people are actually standing up for their national liberation in the same manner, fighting any type of conflict, then they're viewed as terrorists. So there's this double standard across the board.
What do you think causes so many young Americans to be so violent? That's the question we put to the public.
I didn't know young Americans were so violent, to tell you the truth. From what I understand, the only difference between America and the rest of the industrialized world is that we have more access to guns, and young people have more access to guns.
I don't think young Americans are more violent than other people.
I think what causes Americans to be so violent is the government showing that violence is the only thing that's respected. Money and violence, that's all I see everyone ever gets respected for. So I think they feel like it's fine, it's okay, and they can do it since the government's doing it, why not us?
Exposure to violence in the media, whether it's for entertainment or for news. If you look at Bandura's social theory experiment, I'm probably messing up the name, but he actually demonstrated how viewing aggression can cause the viewer to promote aggressive and violent tendencies.
I don't know. I guess it could be a multiple different things. It could be media. It could be the way that people are raised. But I don't know.
Is there an objective way to explain why young Americans are resorting to violence? We asked our experts.
I think there are a number of things. You see, we underestimate how much the history. See, neoliberalism is the latest fad, is the global, is the moment we are now in the global is more or less described as neoliberal. And by neoliberalism, I don't mean in a kind of pejorative, insulting way. I just mean the economic, cultural arrangement of the world is very much neoliberal. Within it, it is what I call it's toxic in terms of masculinity. Yeah? In order to be a man in that weird way, toxic masculinity comes together with violence. Yeah? And so it's not possible to distinguish between the masculinities and the violence of the way in which the neoliberal times, of which America is very much the epitome example of, meaning that goes somewhere to explaining the violent nature of American society, both within and as it exports it elsewhere.
Well, I think that in a society like the United States, which was built on the enslavement of African people, and it was built on the wholesale genocide of the indigenous people, of the so-called Native Americans, and it's maintained through imperialist war, then it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that the society has so many violent characteristics within it. And, police violence is the most glaring example of that, but also a situation like the shooting in Carolina, where you see contradictions coming to a head. You have a society which seems to be moving in a progressive direction. Left-wing ideas especially are gaining traction among young people, but then it pushes these type of forces who are very overtly racist into a situation where they feel as if they're losing their grip on what they consider to be their country. So it brings them into the rage and into situations where they may commit more of these kind of terrorist activities.
Next, we wanted to find out if the American public knew how many people had been killed by the US police in roughly the first half of 2015, and what effect they felt that police brutality was having on American citizens.
I don't know, but I'm sure it's a lot.
Yeah, it's over 500. What effect does police brutality have on the citizens?
Eventually, the citizens are going to uprise, and it's going to be anarchy.
It's very demoralizing, but I think that the problem has been that it has been demoralizing mostly to the black community, and that most whites have no idea about that this is going on. So now that everyone is a little bit more aware, we can all be demoralized and hope for the best.
I do not.
It's over 500. Now, what effect does police brutality have on the citizens?
I think it's assuming that the police brutality is unnecessary. I think it makes citizens kind of feel like they can't rely on their police force, and it might cause them to take matters into their own hands and possibly become a little bit reckless in regard to their own safety, which leads to a downward spiral of anarchy.
It has a very negative effect, and it's certainly not going to encourage peace and love.
I'm not sure.
500, over 500.
Oh, okay. That's a lot.
What effect does police brutality have on the citizens?
It has a negative effect on the citizens, because generally citizens will look down on that.
Let's get some facts from our experts. How many people have been killed by US police in the first half of 2015? And can we assess the impact of those killings on American citizens?
Well, the thing about, first of all, the numbers are so huge, it's almost meaningless to actually get to them. The thing about the availability of guns on one hand, and what I call toxic masculinity on the other hand, if you bring them together, it is not surprising. The gun culture is already there, okay? So you have a society that is already conflictual. Then you have the culture of policing, which determines the relationship between young people, particularly black young men, and the police as the institution. That combination is what produces what is going on in the United States now. And the more precarious it gets, the worse it gets. My wish for the United States is if it could address its gun culture on one hand, and how its society is so marked racially. And as long as those two things are there, we will see more, sadly, we'll see more of this that's been going on, whether it's to do with gun culture, whether it's to do with bombing of churches, whether it's just to do, we will see more of that the more the world gets more and more precarious because of the combination of all those two things.
Well, I think the latest tally for the number of people killed by the police in the US was about 550 at some point early this week. And it's going up every single day. I mean, there were some reports saying that it's about one incident happening every 8 hours now. The statistic that's usually taken for granted is that one African American, whether man or woman, is killed every 28 hours by the police. I mean, there's also incidences of trans violence against the LGBTQ community, and especially among, so-called ethnic minorities who are from those particular communities. So, I think that it's something that's going to continue to happen because the system hasn't fundamentally changed, even with, a so-called progressive president at the helm of it. And it's viewed, I think, within society as a big issue now. Because 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I don't think the numbers were really any less. I don't think the police brutality has increased that dramatically. I think that it's the age of the camera phone and the age of the internet where people are more aware of the fact that this is happening.
2 Los Angeles police officers shot an unarmed man in the head after he asked for help, after which they handcuffed his motionless body. Does the US police force have any credibility left at all? We asked the public.
There is credibility because we know that there are a lot of good, responsible police around. Otherwise, we wouldn't be living in a peaceful society, basically. But there needs to be more education about with the police force so that this doesn't happen. It's pretty bad.
Well, I saw that video and that was really, really, really disturbing. I can't say that like just because a group of individual police officers will lead to the downfall and credibility of a whole system, but it definitely makes people rethink why what the police does for our ordinary citizens.
Not in my eyes. I feel like it's their fault, and it's only gonna get worse. So hopefully gun violence stops soon, because life is amazing and people just taking away all these innocent lives, and how do you know if that person was gonna make a difference?
Probably very little after that. And it's not only that, it's a series of events such as that one that really gives, law enforcement a real negative perspective from citizens. And I guess they got to do something to change that.
Absolutely not. And matter of fact, those 2 cops who did that, they should be put in prison. And I believe any cop who commits a crime should get twice the amount of time that a citizen would get.
How do incidents such as handcuffing the dead body of a man the police themselves have just shot affect the police force's credibility? We put that to our experts.
Well, they haven't really, because the relations, first of all, nobody on this planet everybody on this planet wants to see a good police service that protects everybody's interest. But it depends on what that police service becomes associated with, okay? And so the issue is not about whether or not there is police, it's what the police in the United States have become associated with. And the police in the United States have become associated with the front line of racial histories. They are seen as they are policing communities to fall into line as opposed to looking after everybody's interests. No. So people generally, in the everyday, that is in the way they live day to day, the policeman is not the person whom you go to seek for help. The policeman is somebody who ran away, one. Because it's such a highly racialized, toxic society, okay, the police tend to, or institutions tend to, not just the police, have these stereotypes of what they think a person is. Yeah? A young person is criminal or unemployed or something else. If they're walking in an unusual way, they must. So you're criminal first before you're a human being. That is not produced by the nature of policing. That is the nature of the society from which the police are drawn.
Well, I think on the question of credibility, it really depends who you ask that question to. I think if you talk to people from the ruling class, then they'll of course say, sure, the police have credibility, but even they're forced to address it now. But they'll spin it as being the case of a few bad apples. They'll spin it as the case of bad police versus so-called good police. Those of us who advocate revolutionary changes in society, we're clear that these incidents are never isolated and they're never the result of so-called bad apples. The situation where Kimani Gray was killed in New York, or the situation where Freddie Gray was murdered in Baltimore, these were just symptoms of the actual disease. Police brutality or police terrorism is a symptom of the greater disease, which is capitalism itself. And once we understand that that's the case, then we can look for the cure, which has to be revolution, right? It has to be the transformation of a system of individualism, a system that needs racism for its continued survival and needs brutality for its continued survival, into a system that actually values human life, and that system would be socialism.
Can the US public understand why so much racism and police violence is taking place under a black Democrat president? Here's what we found out.
Well, Obama's trying to help change the atmosphere. You can't expect one man, one president to change everything overnight. He can do a lot, but he needs the Congress, he needs the Democratic Party, he needs the Republican Party, and there's a lot of power that's in place way beyond the presidency.
Yeah, because it's systemic racism in the country, Like, the fact that we have a black president doesn't mean that racism goes away.
I think he's a black puppet, not a black president. That's what I think.
I think the president has limited power to be able to change things like that.
We have a long legacy. You can't get rid of that legacy in just like 4 or 8 years.
It does seem curious that so much police violence and racism can occur under an administration led by a black Democrat president. Our experts considered how this could have happened.
When Barack Obama was elected, I mean, everybody, including myself, went into euphoria. We thought it would introduce a different way of thinking. We were mistaken, because we thought one could think race outside a number of its other places. Race is capable of living in a room full of black people. It is capable of finding a place. It operates amoeba-like. We underestimated its capacity to find an avenue, some form, or to return with a vengeance. So, and what was missing is to understand what forms race takes. You see, race is both a very attractive thing. I mean, I think of every advertiser on the planet. You know, they like to have a black face on the image. After all, it sells images. But that's not the same thing as translating your institutions. The thing about racism is how it translates itself institutionally. When it becomes, of course it starts on what individual people think or don't think, but what happens institutionally. And if you think that racism has disappeared because people are just being nice together, you're missing the point. Because the bank is not going to think about whether you're nice or not. It creates groups which are included or not included. So what Barack Obama's administration has done is to pursue the institutional location of racism, so that when the institutions have ran riot, they haven't been able to do anything else. So we were mistaken to think that somehow we thought it could, but it didn't.
So the election of Barack Obama was, without a doubt, a historic moment in the history of the United States, because for the first time we have an African-American president. And I didn't think that that would be something that would be possible, perhaps even within my lifetime. And I think that a lot has changed over the past few decades in terms of ideas that people have moving, again, in a more progressive direction. But the fact that there's a black president hasn't fundamentally changed the white supremacist nature of the system. You can have somebody at the head of a system who actually is complicit and whose sole duty it is to act against his own interests. And I mean, this is like neo-colonialism that we see in Africa, or you see throughout the countries that have been liberated from colonial rule, where the foreign powers maintain their grip on that particular society that they dominated, but they use the face of a local in order to maintain that oppression. So I think we have to be very cautious about the way that we view the Obama phenomenon, because on the one hand, it has a progressive side to it, but on the other hand, it sort of allows these racists almost, free rein in their activities.
Violent attacks and racist killings, as well as police brutality, put America at the top of nearly all international rankings for such incidents. There are simply too many racist murders, violent crimes, and cases of police brutality for the United States to continue to pretend that nothing has gone seriously wrong. Despite the media's willingness to whitewash the facts, to many observers, America is beginning to look like an increasingly dysfunctional and violent society.